I was born at Wampee, a little village in Horry County, and that's in the North Myrtle Beach area. And I was born at home. There were no hospitals close by, and I grew up there, finished high school there, and finished high school in 1929. My mother was Adela Bellamy and married a Bell. I was a Bell, and my father died when I was 9 years old. And my mother had 7 children, and 3 of them were younger than I was. And she had to take over the family, and so we had a very good family, but of course missed the father very, very much. I had most of my family settled in this area, and they grew up in the high school there. But the 2 of them were older than I was, or 3 of them were older than I was, and so they did not have the advantage of the school system except just up to the high school period, because I was a member of the first graduating class of Wampee High School. I went to junior college after I finished high school, and that was during the Depression years, of course. And I had 2 jobs, worked 2 jobs in college. And when I finished the junior college, I did not have money enough to go on, and so I taught school at Long, South Carolina, and for 1 year, and that was the year I met my future husband. And we were talking of getting married at that time, and I was just 18 when I was teaching. And then we decided that maybe I needed to go back to school. So I went to Columbia College for 2 years, and as soon as I finished college, we were married in September after I finished college in June. I was a waitress for a table, but I had the entire work of that. I had to wash the dishes for that table, and I had to set the table and be totally responsible for it. The college had a farm, and they had a milking machine, but they brought the milk into the kitchen, and it was processed there. And so it was, the added job that I had was to wash the machine. And why I was chosen, I did not know why, but they said that they had watched me wash the dishes from my table, and they thought I did a better job of washing the dishes than anybody in the school, and so they gave me that extra job. It was hard work, but I needed it to pay for my tuition. Well, I took a regular AB course, and I was not very smart. I didn't have time to study much, but I made it.
Somehow
I did graduate.
I don't believe that.
My husband was a Methodist minister, but at the time that I met him, he was in seminary at Duke University. And he had a friend who was my pastor at that time. And we had church young people, young ministers, when they came in, had to have a circuit because there were several churches on the circuit. And my pastor was at Wampee, but he also had this church at Long's. And so he asked my future husband to have a revival meeting there. And since the school was very small, the church was small, they would let the school out for the children to go to church in the morning when they had the service. And so I carried my children. I had 6. I had the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd grade and had 6 children. And so that was my class. And when I was walking out with the children, he shook hands with me and he said, "And young lady, what grade are you in?" See, I was just 18 at that point. And I said, "Well, I am the teacher at this time." And so he told the minister, who was my pastor, that he would like to see me again sometime while he was here during that week. And so after church each night, we did get together at the place where I was boarding. And then he invited me up to Duke for a weekend. And I went, and that was in September, and during November, I think it was, that he was appointed to Blaine Church, and he had 5 churches: Blaine Church, Myrtle Beach, Socastee, Centenary, and Bethel. And then after I graduated from Columbia College, we married and came to Murrells Inlet. We were married in the Myrtle Beach church. And I lived in Wampee, and we had a small church there, and that was my church. But because he was a minister at Myrtle Beach, they asked us to get married there, and that they would take care of everything. And that was very good for me because it didn't cost me anything. Then we went to Charleston on our honeymoon, and then went on to Atlanta, and we stopped at at a friend's home at Bluffton and spent the 2nd night in Bluffton, but he was not there. He just left the house for us. And then we went on to Atlanta and visited with some friends in Atlanta and came back to Murrells Inlet. And that was in September 1934. When I got to Murrells Inlet, it was not exactly a village, but it could be called a village, I guess. But the people were in various places, and so there was not a town at all. And there were no paved roads, there was no electricity, there was no heat. We had an open fireplace was what we heated with, and in the kitchen we had a wood stove. And no telephones except Mr. Eason. Mr. Eason was here, and he had a store. I do not know when he came and started the store, but it was the only store in Murrells Inlet when we arrived. And when we left, of course, it was the only store.
And he had a telephone.
What? And he had a telephone, and it was a telephone that he had connected himself with Conway. And he was good to everybody in this area. If they needed to get a message to anybody, they would go to Mr. Eason and he would give you the message. And that's where we bought our groceries. He had boarded with Mrs. Oliver before I came down. See, he had been here 3 years when we married, and he boarded at Miss Oliver's. People were without jobs, and that was when the inland waterway came through, and we met some of the people who had come, but it was just a real bad situation. People did not have any money, and he had 5 churches, and his salary was supposed to be $1,000 a year. And the first year he was here, he was paid $800 in actual cash money, but part of that was with produce that the people gave him, and he brought it back, and Ms. Oliver accepted it on his board and gave him credit for it. And he asked somebody who had an open truck, and he went around, they drove that truck, and everybody gave him eggs, they gave him chickens, they gave him vegetables, canned vegetables and things of that kind. The people were farmers. There were the Olivers, the Wesleys, the Fultons, the Stevensons, and Dr. King's family in the summer, the Wilcoxes, the Chandlers, the Smiths, the Grants, the Bereans, Easons, the Connollys, the Stevenson family. Now, they lived right down here on the creek. And Mrs. Stevenson evidently was related to Mrs. Oliver or Captain Oliver, and everybody called him Cap. But everybody at the inlet almost called Mrs. Stevenson Cousin Mabel. I talked with Mrs. Stevenson's granddaughter the other day, and she said that they farmed when I asked her how they came to be down here, and she said that they farmed, had a farm over here. And but most of the people lived out of the creek. It seemed that there were a good many people down here, but they were not close together, what you would call just a little unit of people. Now at Wampee we had a good many families right together, but we did not have that here at the inlet. They were up and down the creek. And then some of them over in the area where they were farming. There were some of them even as far as Paula's Island that came to the church up here. Before I married my husband, Mrs. Oliver, the parsonage was next door, and she had a big bell, and if she needed anybody in the parsonage, she would ring that bell. So one night my husband said that he was sitting around reading, and he heard the bell ring. And Miss Oliver had school teacher boarders, and she started out to ring the bell, and he heard the bell, and he ran over to see what was wrong. And they had a fire in one of the teacher's rooms upstairs, and they were afraid that they were going to have, and she was ringing the bell for him to come and help. And they had a bucket brigade and put that fire out. And when he came, she told him, she said, "Preacher, get a bucket and get some water." And he grabbed the bucket, and it was full of milk that Captain Oliver had been to milk the cow, and it hadn't been strained and fixed. And he took the bucket of milk and threw it on the fire upstairs, and they were able to put that fire out. It really did put the fire out in the girls' rooms upstairs, and it was caught from a trash burner. That was the heat they were using at Oliver's Lodge at that time. Oh yes, everybody looked out for the other fellow if they were sick. Once there was a mad dog that had bitten one of the children down here, and my husband had to drive to Columbia with the child to be able to get the medicine that it needed. Gussie and Joe lived down here, and they lived out in an area where there was they had a little piece of land that they owned, and they grew vegetables and things on that, but he was a creek man. And she was a very wonderful person and a wonderful cook. And during the summer, people from Marion and that area would come down here, and they would live, and Gussie and Joe worked for Dr. King. Dr. King's family from Aner lived down here in the summertime. And so Gussie was Miss King's cook, but when we arrived, she wanted a place to work some, and so she worked with us. And she did all my husband's laundry, did our laundry for us. And so when our son was born down here, Gussie was working for us. And my husband went into, I came home from the hospital. My son was born in Conway. When I came home from the hospital, Gussie was in the kitchen cooking for us and taking care of me. And my husband had only one suit during the Depression that he could preach in. And so he felt that he had, with all the problems of going back and forth with the new baby and everything, he didn't have his suit pressed for Sunday morning. And so he went into the kitchen and he said, "Gussie, would you iron this suit for me? Brush the mud off the cuffs of this suit and press it for me." And she said, "No, sir, Reverend, I don't iron on Sunday." And he said, "But Gussie, the ox is in the ditch." And she said, "Yes, Reb, but he your ox, he ain't mine." And she would not press the suit. Now I'll go back a little bit to somebody else that helped us, and that was Billy Sparkman. Billy worked for Mrs. Oliver at Oliver's Lodge, and she had trained him to do anything that she needed with seafood that would come out. They would bring shrimp in. They needed to be deheaded, and Billy would do that, and she trained him to make beds and to sweep and to clean up and that sort of thing. But he was a little bit retarded, and he would get in a bad shape, bad spirit sometimes, and wouldn't work very well. And she would call us and she said, "Billy's not having a good time and he needs to be away from me, so I'm going to fire him, and I hope you all will hire him." So Billy worked for us from time to time, and he would come every morning and you could hear him a mile away singing, "There's an old spinning wheel in the parlor," and we would know that Billy was on his way. And after a few weeks, Miss Oliver would be ready for him back, and she would call and say, "I need Billy again." we lived mostly on seafood and vegetables. People farmed, and we had a little space that my husband had a small garden. And we sometimes had a few chickens so that we could have chicken as meat. And maybe once a month, Mr. Eason would get in some fresh beef and would get a piece of beef down there. But we ate mostly oysters, shrimp, crab, clams, you name it.
Fish.
If it came out of the ocean, we had it. And the fishermen used the front yard of our parsonage to go in and out of the creek, and that's where they could go in. We allowed them to go in and out of the creek. And so when we would get up in the morning, oftentimes there would be a string of fish on the front door. And Joe, going back to Joe, he furnished us in clams and oysters. The recreation that the young people had down here, most of it came through the churches. The Presbyterian church was active, and the Blaine church was active, but it was a very small church. But oyster roast was a big thing in the fall of the year, that we had no other, they didn't have money enough to have all the recreation that we have today. It was such a rural section, and only a few people knew about it. Mr. Huntington was here, and at Mrs. Oliver's boarding house, she had some of the people that worked for Mr. Huntington. In fact, there was a young man that was his chauffeur that stayed at Mrs. Oliver's, and his name was Freddie Rimbert. And
was he a South Carolinian?
yes, he was a South Carolinian. He, I think, was maybe from Georgetown. I'm not sure, but he was the chauffeur for Mr. Huntington. Mr. and Ms. Tarbox were members of our church, and Mrs. Tarbox was a minister's daughter, and so she was very active in the Blaine church at that time. Mr. Tarbox's uncle, I believe it was a bishop. There was a Bishop Tarbox in the Methodist church, and so the Tarboxes worked. He was the gardener for Mr. Huntington, who really landscaped and did the gardens to begin with. And so the Tarboxes were very active in the beginning of Murrells Inlet. And there were some of the Tarboxes that were in Georgetown, and that was the same family that they were here. Yes, I used to go down there often when, after I married and I was down here permanently for a year and a half. Yes, I did meet Mr. Huntington. In fact, he was very, very generous with the churches in this area, and they needed it. And at Christmas time, Mr. Tarbox told us that he would like for someone to go down and talk with Mr. Huntington, and that Mr. Huntington had told him that he wanted to do something for the churches, for the children in the churches, and the poor children. And so Dot Oliver, Miss Oliver's daughter, and I went down, and we had an appointment with Mr. Huntington, and we went in his office and sat and talked with him about an hour, and he asked us what we planned to do for the children and so on, and he gave us money for the Christmas tree. And then my husband had an appointment with him at one time. Mr. Tarbox, being a member of our church, he told my husband, he said, I think Mr. Huntington would like to talk with you. And my husband said, Mr. Tarbox, I don't know whether Mr. Huntington would like to talk with me or not, because he's a very busy man, and I don't know. And he said, oh yes, I think he would. And he said, well, if you'll make an appointment with him, I'll go. And so he went, and Mr. Huntington, he said, was very, very kind to him, and that they had a wonderful time together. And when he started to leave, Mr. Huntington said, well, sir, I would like to give you a little cash, but I'm a little short on cash today. And my husband said, Mr. Huntington, I didn't come down here asking you for cash. He said, I came because I wanted to talk with you. Then Mr. Tarbox said that you would like to talk with me. He said, oh hell, I know that. And he said, but I don't have much cash, but I've got a little bit. And so he handed it. He said, please take this. So my husband took it, and he laughed. He said when he got halfway down the driveway, he stopped to see how much it was, and it was $101 bills. And he said he had never seen that much cash at one time in his life. And he was now in the ministry. But so he was a very generous man, and really, he was the main person who helped the poor people, particularly the black people in this area. But the black people were very, very kind. We loved all of them. There was no such thing as bad people down here, bad black people. For 4 years. At that time, ministers had to, you were subject to move every year, but you could not stay longer than 4 years. And so at the end of 4 years, we knew we had to leave. And then we went to Beaufort, and we were there 4 years. So our first his first 8 years were on the coast. Well, our daughter was born in Beaufort, and they were both born on the coast, and so they both like the coast till this day. I guess it was just in their bone somewhat. And then we moved from there to Providence, which was in Orangeburg County. And that was a very rural area, but a very prosperous area. And they did not, their actual cash that they paid us was not very much in the way of salary. But they kept us in food the entire time we were there. And we always tried to run on a budget. And my allowance for the week was $10 for a family of 4. And I was easily able to work my budget out with that, because there was so much food given to us from the community that I had very little to buy. And then my son started to school there in the 1st grade. And then we moved to Bamberg and lived there. And I guess that was our favorite place together, because we stayed there 6 years, and our children were in school, and we were involved with so many of the families of our area and with the school situation.
And it was while we were living in Bamberg that Mother and Daddy decided to build a home, a summer home in Murrells Inlet. I think they started it perhaps during World War II, but it was probably completed in around 1947. So from that point on, we spent summers here. The house was built on Blaine property, which my daddy leased from Blaine Trust, from the Blaine United Methodist Trust. And he leased it for 20 years. So the house was right across the street from Blaine Church now. And then they sold it and moved it. And then in 1965, Mother and Daddy bought this house that we're in now. So that's how our years were spent in the summer. I never went to Myrtle Beach, you know, to the amusement park. I didn't know anything about the amusement park being in Myrtle Beach. I learned to swim in the creek. I was a great crabber, and I could pull a shrimp net, and I could clam, and all I needed was somebody to take me out in a boat, which my brother could do. My father did, and in those days we rowed, and we would row out away from the shore, and we would go clamming and crabbing and pull a shrimp net and come home with a great amount of seafood that my lovely mother would cook for us.
We didn't actually spend the summers, but we came as often as we could. When she said that didn't mean we left home, but we came often enough that we could have some time down here. And I had a nephew, my sister lived in Conway, and I had a nephew who was the age of my son, and he would come with us. And we still had Joe and Gussie at that time sometimes. And so Joe would take my husband out in the boat to fish. And the two boys wanted to go with them. And they were supposed to help with the fishing or with the shrimp nets. They would do anything when they would go out in the boat. And they were just messing around out there one day. And Joe said, preacher said, them boys, they don't want to fish and work, they're just here on excursion. An excursion, but he called it excursion. They're just here on excursion. But they did learn to love Murrells Inlet. And today they all still love Murrells Inlet.
I live here permanently.
Now?
Now. Mother lives at the Methodist Manor in Florence at the present time. I do have a daughter and a granddaughter that live here. And I have a son in Columbia, and he and his wife and children love to come, but they rather stay at this house than at my house. And then I have a daughter that lives in Florida. And she comes, and every time she comes, it's always, Mama, I really don't want to go back. So I guess that through Mother and Daddy, our love of Murrells Inlet came about. Mother and Daddy had some friends that were visiting with them, and he was a man that, he was a bachelor, and he didn't like kids, and you could kind of tell he didn't like kids. And I could kind of sense that he kind of wanted to get rid of me. And so somehow he did get rid of me. He offered me a quarter for every crab that I could catch. And so I thought, well, I'm gonna show him. So I took several bushel baskets and some chicken necks and went to the creek, and I came back just several bushel baskets full of big old crabs. And he didn't really want to pay me. And I can remember my daddy looking at him and saying, you know, you made that wager. You better come up with the money. And of course, being a bachelor, he will remain nameless as far as I'm concerned right now. But anyway, I made him come up with the money.
Well, when we built the little house, before we came into this house, we literally built it ourselves. We went in with another minister, and because they lived close, they were friends, close friends, had been for years, and we lived we lived in Bamberg, and they lived in Denmark, and so we would come down here, and they put up the framing of it, and floored it, and put the roof on, and we would come and work for 2 or 3 days. They would wouldn't take a vacation day during the week at all and save up so that we could come and work on the house. And we got it so we could sleep in it and live with it. And so Margaret Ann and our son would come with us. And one night, my sister and her husband were coming over to visit from Conway, and they heard Margaret Ann screaming, and she was just screaming bloody murder. And they jumped out of the car and they came in. She said, "There's a snake in here. There's a snake in here." And sure enough, it was a big snake in the house.
That we think might have been living in the house all along, you know, from the early days of construction. But okay. But we enjoyed it. Our little house was built with discards from the lumber company. You see, that was during the war, and good lumber was hard to get. Not only that, it was expensive, and we still did not have much money at that point. But we wanted a place to get away, and so we used discards from the mill, and when we furnished it with anything anybody would give us that was in the attic or anywhere, and we got beds together, and from that day on, we have enjoyed Murrells Inlet. And when we had a chance to buy this house, it was because they no longer would renew the lease on the little house that we had, which was one of the best things that could have happened, because we have enjoyed this house very, very much. I'm not sure just when the Blaine Church was organized. I do know that King Scoggins, who is living today, was born in the parsonage, and that was in 1922. And so it was an organized church, I guess, but the building that was here when my husband was pastor was built in 1925, I think it was, and that was just before my husband came in 31, you see. And she had a church torn down. Miss Oliver.
Miss Oliver had the church torn down, and it was brought back up here to that spot where the parsonage was, and rebuilt. And they brought the materials by mule and wagon, and that was in 1925.
Mother said that in the summertime you might have 25 people attending Blaine Church. That was with the summer population, right?
That's right.
And now Blaine Church membership is almost 2,500, I guess, possibly. I'm not sure of the exact amount, but anyway, it's a.
Well, you can see that I've lived over that period, but going back to about when the church was organized, the Bedenbows were here before the Scoggins, and there are either or just after, but anyway, they used to call it King's Crest, and that's where Dr. King lived. They called it King's Crest, and they called Oliver's Oliver Rest, and they called the parsonage Beedenbow's Nest, because Mr. Beedenbow was a pastor there, and they would say, King's Crest, Oliver Rest, Beedenbow's Nest. And we heard that, I heard that right after I came here. But Mr. Scoggins, who is a Methodist minister still living now, was born in the parsonage at Murrells Inlet, in a very rural area. But he was named King because Dr. King came from Aner to be here during the delivery. We lived in the parsonage, and when we lived there, they had the front section of the parsonage, and then they had built the kitchen on the back, and there was a breezeway between. And on cold mornings, I had to get up and go through that breezeway to the kitchen, and it was really cold.
The parsonage, you know, today is the home of Genevieve Peterkin. It was built for a summer home for Reverend Blaine. The Blaine plantation, as it was, contains something over 1,000 acres and still belongs to the Methodist Church of South Carolina. My husband was Dr. Chuck May, who was originally from Bennettsville, South Carolina. And I had enjoyed our summers coming to visit with Mother and Daddy and as children. And so in 1986, we decided to purchase the home that I now live in. And it was part of the original 3 houses that were built at that time during the 40s. We enjoyed it as a creek house for a good many years, and Hugo hit, and we kind of put it back together because our daughter was getting married at the time and wanted to have her wedding reception in the front yard. So we put it back together, and in 1992, we decided that we would like to live here permanently when he retired. And so we remodeled the house for permanent living at that time, and one of the things that we had to do was lift the house up. If you improved over 50%, you had to lift the house up above flood level. And that was an interesting process. A man by the name of Mr. Linwood Lee came down here and told us that he could do the job. And he told me, he said, you can leave everything in your house, you can leave it on the mantle, anything, it'll all be just fine. And I decided that I really didn't really trust him that much, but anyway. We remodeled our home, and in '96 my husband retired, and I guess we had 12 good, great years down here together. And he died in 2008, and our children continue to love it. And I enjoy my daughter, who comes by every morning, having her here, and I don't think that I'm gonna ever leave. I hope not.